Ritza Sejorna. That is hello and welcome in High Valyrian. All right, so tonight, our special guest is David J. Peterson, who is a conlanger, or a constructor of languages, and best known as the linguist mastermind behind the Dothraki and the High Valyrian languages used within the world of Westeros. He has also constructed languages for other popular shows and films, including Penny Dreadful, The Witcher, Thor, The Dark World, Dune, and many others. David is a graduate of UC Berkeley with a Bachelor of Arts degrees in English and Linguistics, and received his Master of Arts degree in Linguistics from UCSD. Woo! That's where I went. So he is the co-founder of the Language Creation Society and served as the president from 2011 to 2014. And he actually won a contest held by the Game of Thrones creator through the Language Creation Society to develop the fictional Dothraki language, and has gone on to create no less than 7 other languages for the series. And in case you're wondering, David himself is fluent in Spanish and has studied over 20 other languages. Born in Long Beach, David currently resides in Orange County and is the father of a 6-year-old who is here with him tonight. Welcome. So let's give a big warm welcome to David from NHM. Thank you. Okay, so before we start, how many of you have rewatched all 8 seasons of the Game of Thrones during COVID or recently to get ready for the House of Dragons? Show of hands, please. Okay, some of you need to catch up. But we're ready. We have a few questions. So, David, for those of us who are unfamiliar with the idea of constructed languages, can you explain what they are and how they differ from what is typically considered a natural language?
So natural languages are the ones that we speak here on Earth, and they are created as well by humans. All the languages that we speak are ultimately created by humans, but of course they were created unconsciously and by billions and billions of speakers casually over the centuries, basically by us just trying to communicate with one another. A constructed language, on the other hand, is a language that's created on purpose by one or more people for a variety of reasons. One that maybe people will have heard of is the Esperanto language. It was created in 1887, and that was created to facilitate international communication. Something like the Klingon language, it was created by Mark Okrand, was quite different. It wasn't created to facilitate international communication. It was created for a fictional race of aliens in Star Trek. And so, obviously, when you create a language like that versus a language like Esperanto, there are different goals. So the languages I created for Game of Thrones, and then that are later now used in House of the Dragon, were created basically to fill out that fictional world, to make that world feel as real as our world. And so, you know, they're languages just like ours with all the quirks and irregularities that ours have. They were just created both kind of like as a medium of communication and also as kind of a set piece. Just like, you know, the Iron Throne is created to look really cool and look authentic, that's the way the languages were created as well.
Did you notice he said on Earth? I mean, this is something I noticed. Thank you. So tell us what your process is like when it comes to creating a new language, and are there any resources or anthropological influences you typically seek out?
Focusing on the ones that I created for Game of Thrones, the first thing that we all started out with was we were trying to adapt a book series created by George R.R. Martin, and trying to do so as faithfully as we could, you know, with the constraints of budget and Hollywood and, you know, what we could pull off. Our primary resource was always the books that George R.R. Martin had created. And where those books stopped, they were the resources that George R.R. Martin himself used. So, for example, when George R.R. Martin was creating the Dothraki people, he used as inspiration not only the Mongolian language, but also the Mongolian people of the Silk Road era. And so what I would do then is, where there wasn't something directly from the books that I could use for inspiration for an idiom or for a word or something like that, is I would just go to the resources that he used himself. In other words, all of the anthropological resources that exist for the Mongolian people of the Silk Road era, and also just well beyond that, also climate data and flora and fauna, basically like how likely is it, excuse me, how likely is it for a particular animal to exist in this type of climate? How likely is it for a plant like this to exist in this type of climate? In other words, like if I need a word for this, is it likely that they're going to have their own word for it? Or will they have borrowed it from somebody else where that plant was more likely to exist naturally? So that's kind of the type of thing that I do as I'm going through and fleshing out the thousands and thousands of vocabulary items that we need to have a functional language.
Wow, so we're on the topic of George R.R. Martin. And those of you familiar, the first book, the Song of Ice and Fire series, what were your first impressions or observations about what already existed in the book versus what you had to create?
So I will tell you that reading science fiction and fantasy literature, often the bar for created languages is pretty low. The stuff that you find is just not very good. So when I was looking at that time, there were 4 books in the series that had been written. When I was looking for all the material that was on either Dothraki or Valyrian, I was looking for, first, is it consistent? And second, is it different from English, or is it just coded English? And then, third, what kind of interesting things can I find? And I have to tell you, the first one is often the hardest. The first one is often the hardest. You usually do not find consistent work. But I was so grateful that with all the Dothraki material that was in there, and even the small amount of Valyrian material that was in there, it was 100% consistent. It actually made sense. I was like, oh, thank goodness. So it wasn't very much, but I could use that as a base without having to try to come up with a reason, for example, why, in all of these examples, adjectives come before nouns, but then in this one example, the adjective comes after the noun. That's happened before to me in a different book series, which I won't name. But it was like, it was 100% consistent. It was great. Like with Dothraki, the adjectives always came after the nouns, just like they do in Spanish, which was great. In Valyrian, the verb always came at the end, which was great. All of the nouns had these consistent endings, which were indicative of declensions like you have in Latin and Greek, which was enormously helpful to me, because then I could use that as a base, build out and create more, and everything that was in the books would still actually work. It wouldn't be like, well, this is the stuff that we did for the show and it's all functional and you have to, wink at the stuff that's in the book. It's like, no, it all works. It all works 100%. And I was so grateful for that.
Great. So we've been hearing a little bit about the roots of Dothraki, but, and take your time with this because I was
Sure.
really fascinated with you explaining this the other day. What is the difference between High Valyrian and the other Low Valyrian languages in the series?
The Valyrian languages are really interesting in the book series because, again, often when you go to other types of science fiction and fantasy, what you usually have is either everybody is speaking English, right? Or everybody is speaking English and then a few of the bad guys speak this other language, and those are like the only 2 languages on the planet. In George R.R. Martin's books, it's really wonderful because even when you don't see examples of all the various languages, he alludes to them. And he talks about them the way that languages work in our world, which is that we don't just have languages that pop up here and there. Languages come in families. Languages descend from other languages as groups of people move from one area to another. So, for example, the reason we call the Romance languages is because they descend from Latin, spoken around Rome. So that, Portuguese and Italian and French and Spanish and Catalan, they're all related to one another in predictable ways that you can actually see. The Valyrian languages are similar. There was a language called High Valyrian, which was the language of an empire called the Valyrian Freehold, which at the time of Game of Thrones is dead. And in fact, even at the time of House of the Dragon, it's also dead by that point. It's an ancient empire that has been destroyed. High Valyrian was the language of that empire. People from that empire spread out in various places and took the language with them where it changed a little bit. So if you've heard of the free cities, The Free Cities all speak Valyrian languages, but not High Valyrian. In the show, in the books, they're referred to, pardon me for the word, they're referred to as bastard Valyrian languages. I call them Low Valyrian. It's a bit of a, it's good for the under 8 crowd. But the idea was, the way he describes them is actually the way that ancient historians and scholars would talk about the diverging Romance languages at the beginning. They would talk about all of these people as speaking broken Latin, or the common Latin. This is why it was called vulgar Latin. Vulgar meant of the people. Because what they couldn't see at the time was that this was actually the birth of brand new languages. They weren't speaking broken Latin. They were speaking Old Spanish and Old French and Old Italian. That was the birthplace of all of those languages. And we see that with the Valyrian languages in the books. So in the first show, in Game of Thrones, I was able to create the High Valyrian language, which was preserved by a few people, by the Targaryens, for example, so by Viserys and Daenerys, and then also spoken as a literary language by very rich or wealthy people or very highly educated people. And we also saw a little bit of an area called Slaver's Bay, which was the old Giscari Empire. And this was a place that had been conquered by the Valyrians. They brought their government and their language mixed with the old Giscari language, and produced a brand new one. And that one you actually do hear in the show. It's the one that they speak over in those scenes when Daenerys is in Astapor and Meereen and Yunkai. And it's Valyrian, but a little different. It has some Giscari vocabulary. The grammar has changed a little bit. It's still close, but it's a different enough language that you would actually call it something different, even though in the show they would call it a dialect.
Thank you. I hope this gives a chance for all of you to kind of rethink those shows and the language, and maybe you got to go back and see it the third time before you see House of Dragons and kind of the work and care that came behind that. So tell me, what was your favorite experience watching the characters take on these languages and bring them to life within the series?
I'll tell you two different things. One, my favorite character to kind of watch was always Miss Sandy, who was the translator, because she spoke every language that I created. I think she was the only character that did. And sometimes she would switch between languages in the middle of a sentence, and that was a lot of fun. You don't really see that a lot. I mean, you see it a lot in non-fantasy shows. You see it a lot with code switching when it's portrayed on screen. But it's rare to do that with a constructed language, and so it was a lot of fun to watch her. But it was also fun. I'll mention my favorite bit. This is from the 4th episode of the 3rd season of Game of Thrones. There is a scene where Daenerys is able to reveal that she speaks Valyrian, which the person with whom she was negotiating assumed she didn't speak. Because really her skin color, her complexion, she was from a distant land. He assumed that she didn't understand him, when she did the whole time. She reveals to him that she had in fact understood him the whole time and did it in a specific way. So I was given the line to translate, dragon is not a slave, which has a particular translation in High Valyrian. It would be Zaldrizes dohairi ros ixos daor. With dohairi ros being the word for slave in High Valyrian. But I didn't want to use that because he spoke that variety that was spoken in Slaver's Bay in the old Giscari Empire. And so they had a different word that came from Giscari, and that was buzdar. And so I decided, what would be cool is if we put that word into the High Valyrian to make it abundantly clear. Not only does she speak High Valyrian, but she picked up on his variety of Valyrian as well. And so instead of saying Zaldrizes dohairi ros ixos daor, she says Zaldrizes buzdari ixos daor. And so it makes it abundantly clear, not only do I speak Valyrian, I speak your Valyrian too. And that just helped me. It was a thing that I got to do, and it just helped add a little extra punch. Anyway, that was the best episode of the series.
You can tell he's excited. I actually just saw that scene earlier this week, and I think those of you who are probably bilingual or trilingual or multilingual, there's something kind of fun about that. So we didn't get to experiment a lot tonight, but is there anything you wanted to share with us, a phrase or anything in High Valyrian, maybe talk about with our audience here tonight?
Well, let's see. What could I say? How about, I mean, I don't know if we're at that point, but I could say, let's see. Kirimvos sus bantis gemot uvestran. And that is, to everybody, I say good night.
Oh, I hope it's not a good night yet, but I want to
All right.
thank you for everyone for this conversation. And if you want to learn more Valyrian, surprisingly or not, you can go to Duolingo and learn it from David himself. And he coached me on that first phrase, so thank you so much, David. And he's here this evening and took a long journey. Hope you enjoyed the exhibition, and thank you for coming out.
Thank you.